Not too many Americans know of the French and Indian War, and if they do know about the French and Indian War, fewer still know about George Washington's involvement with it. And it's very important to look back upon and see how the events that affected him in the French and Indian War lead to the leader he'll become in the American Revolution. Now, hate to break some myths about George Washington, but he was not the best tactical commander. He lost more battles than he won. And during the French and Indian War, he had what I can count as 4 major engagements. You can dispute me on that, that's fine. But he had 4 major battles. The first is the skirmish at Jumonville Glen, which we have talked about before here on Redoubt Productions. The first shot to the French and Indian War. The second occurred a few months later, the Battle of Fort Necessity, which was Washington's first and only military surrender. We have also talked about that here in Redoubt Productions. And of course, there is the Battle of Monongahela, probably one of the most famous battles of the French and Indian War. Washington was not commanding, but he was an advisor to Edward Braddock, who ultimately died. The army was routed, so not really good at your track record. And then there's your 4th major engagement, which is a very interesting battle to talk about. This is what George Washington described later in his life as the single most dangerous moment in his entire life. This is the friendly fire incident at Fort Ligonier. The best place to start talking about this incident actually is right in this building. We are currently at Fort Ligonier, which is a museum in Ligonier, Pennsylvania. It was a fort built in 1758, part of the John Forbes campaign to capture Fort Duquesne. 3rd attempt by the British to capture Fort Duquesne. This is the one that'll finally succeed. But how they succeeded is not how the General John Forbes imagined. So the army was delayed, partially by being poorly supplied, partially because of the treacherous terrain they had to come over. They had to build a supply road from Philadelphia over the Allegheny Mountains, which sounds as difficult just saying it, but actually doing it in the 18th century was backbreaking work. They left Philadelphia in June. They didn't really get the army out here until October, November 1758. So they were pressed for time. December's fast approaching, and when winter sets in, well, the snow's going to set in, roads will be impassable, and you're going to have the Donner Party a century earlier here and farther east. So John Forbes, on November 11th, 1758, he had a decision to make. He called all of his officers, most likely here, for a council of war. Why most likely here? Well, John Forbes, though he was a battlefield veteran of 30 years of military experience, very good officer, he was sadly bedridden, as you can see over here. He was suffering from some form of stomach or colon cancer, we believe. So he would have been bedridden while he was here at Fort Ligonier. That's why he had this room built for him, a hut essentially, to keep him shrouded from the rest of the hustle and bustle occurring up in the fort. So most likely the council of war will occur here November 11th, and all the officers are going to be here. His second in command, Henry Bouquet, his quartermaster, John St. Clair, and most likely all of his regimental commands, including Colonel George Washington. They're going to vote, should they advance on Fort Duquesne now or wait till spring? They weigh their odds. If they attack now, there's the risk that they're going to become snowbound. There's also the fact that Forbes' army have fought 2 battles they never prepared for at this point. There was Grant's defeat, September 14th, 1758. 800 Highlanders and Virginians left without approval from Forbes to reconnaissance of Fort Duquesne. Turned out James Grant, the major there, most likely wanted personal glory. He tried to attack the fort, didn't go too well, and it was a small-scale Braddock's defeat. On October 12th, about 600 French and American Indians came from Fort Duquesne and launched an ambush while this fort was under construction. About 1,200 British American soldiers were building this fort. The British Americans that were recruited, for the most part, not very good soldiers. They were mainly grunts to build the road and build forts like Ligonier. They were not really expected to fight good in battle, and when they did get under enemy gunfire, they broke and ran within a few volleys. It's only the Royal Artillery crew that'll spare Fort Ligonier from pure destruction. Most likely, the French-American Indians were not going to destroy Fort Ligonier, merely to disrupt its progress, but the point still stands. Not a really good track record for Forbes' army. So weighing their options, and also I forgot to mention that the enlistments for many of the Americans was going to go up the 1st of December. So if Forbes did begin to besiege Fort Duquesne and it went on too long, they might be stuck out here. The Americans will say, well, screw this, we're going home, folks. We're tired of this campaign. So after weighing these options, the officers vote to actually make winter quarters here at Fort Ligonier. They're just 50 miles from their goal, 50 miles from getting to Fort Duquesne. But the delays have hampered them too much. They're going to have to make winter quarters and have to recruit reinforcements next spring. November 12th will break across Fort Ligonier in the Ligonier Valley. It is a dreary, rainy, foggy day. Temperatures probably no more than the 40s at noon. And Forbes is going to be told there is a small French party coming toward him. Now, after the Battle of Fort Ligonier on October 12th, Forbes had decided to put out a team of scouts a few miles around Fort Ligonier to be essentially your tripwire in case any future French raids were attempted. Forbes was not going to have his army be caught with their pants down again. So this tripwire catches sight of a French war party approaching in the dead of night. Now, from here is where information gets a bit sketchy, and I'm trying to reconstruct events based off of a few poorly descriptive documents. So if you look over here, apologies about the sun, you're going to see this hill. This is part of, you're going to see this hill over here. This is part of Chestnut Ridge. Now, that is where, about 2 miles to the southwest over that ridge, is most likely where the French party were. Forbes is going to turn to a Virginian officer by the name of Colonel George Mercer, who is, as Washington describes later on, a gallant officer. I believe Mercer would have been here during the battle on October 12th. I'm not fully certain. I know elements of the 2nd Virginia were here during the battle. Mercer, around midday, is going to leave his encampments, which were somewhere up there where the town is today. They're going to go across the Loyalhanning Creek and in some direction are going to go over Chestnut Ridge, and they're going to investigate. Late in the afternoon, gunfire will be heard back here at Fort Ligonier, back at camp. Now, the shooting's going to go on for some time, and as the sun starts setting, like it is right now, it appears the gunfire is getting closer to Fort Ligonier. It seems that Mercer is giving up ground. Now, one thing or another, somehow George Washington is going to be sent out to reinforce Mercer, or as Washington describes it, he went out there to personally seek out Mercer, that he was worried for him. Washington will have about 500 soldiers, which is the same size that Mercer's command would have taken earlier in the day, and Washington's men are going to advance from their encampments, which were right along the hill down here, right along this hill here. They were one of the few regiments that had a fortune to be camped within the outer wall of Fort Ligonier. Most of them were camping up where the clearing is, where the town is now. Washington's men will exit, they will cross the creek, and in some direction they're going to cross Chestnut Ridge to investigate. As I had mentioned up there earlier, we are currently walking through the part of the 1st Virginia encampment. So along this hillside here, somewhere would have been George Washington encamped. He most likely had a small A-frame tent at Fort Ligonier. Most of the officers and soldiers during the Forbes campaign slept in tents. As far as I'm aware, John Forbes was one of the only officers to have his personal headquarters. Now, tangent here, my theory is Washington's tent was somewhere close to Forbes' hut. The reason is that Washington was not too enthused of the approach Forbes was taking. Washington wanted Forbes to use the Braddock Road, partially because it had already been built, so it'd save on labor, but also because Washington's a Virginian. Where does Braddock's Road start? Virginia. So Washington's thinking ahead. He knows that whichever road is successful to Pittsburgh is going to be one of the major thoroughfares for future trade and travel. He doesn't want Virginia's rival, Pennsylvania, getting all of those trade goods, getting all the money from maybe putting tolls on Forbes' road. And another tangent, Forbes' road has been used today as the route for US 30, which is you're hearing over here, and also the Pennsylvania Turnpike. So Washington, he was in a sense right. We're still here in Pennsylvania paying taxpayer dollars are going to the Pennsylvania Turnpike, even though it's already paid for, but we won't talk about that. So Washington and Forbes had several arguments, had a falling out by the time he got to Ligonier. So maybe Washington's trying to make up in a last-minute ditch to save his reputation. So maybe he was camped right up there. All right, tangent over. Now, Forbes' road roughly became what is now US 30 and the Pennsylvania Turnpike across southern Pennsylvania. And when you come to Fort Ligonier, what's pretty nifty is the pathway that takes you through the historic site is actually on top of a trace of Forbes' road. This is pretty precise where Forbes' road was. It partially went right through the fort. There was also another segment that looped around the fort, you know, just in case of traffic jams. We don't want everybody going through the fort. So while you're here at Fort Ligonier, you could follow exactly in the footprints of Forbes' road and the advance Washington made on that fateful November 12th. However, as you're going to see, when we're going to do this today, you're going to have to do a bunch of guesswork because the exact trace dead ends right here, and a lot of it's going to be guesswork from here on out. So keep that in mind that this video is not meant to be a 100% certain. This is exactly how, when, and where the friendly fire incident occurred. A general guessing based off my knowledge and understanding of the Forbes campaign. So we're now roughly following in the footsteps of Colonel George Washington. Remember, he was still Colonel at the time. Truth be told, we're going to follow Old Lincoln Highway, which parallels the new Lincoln Highway, the new US 30, which is over there. The 4 lanes through town, the town of Ligonier, actually sit upon the Loyalhanning Creek, where the Loyalhanning Creek would have been 1758. So Washington would have been on that side of the Loyalhanning Creek. So he's on the other side of the 4-lane, other side of the creek. And you can see there's a small open area. So he's following the creek. The creek is his best guide to get to wherever Mercer's last location was. Now Washington's gonna be following the sounds of the gunfire. And I guess his idea is if he's coming this way, he's gonna try to, I guess the idea is to wrap around the hill and maybe catch the French in the rear. Because as Washington describes, the gunfire is getting closer, so the French, at least in Washington's mind, are pressing Mercer back to Fort Ligonier. So Washington is coming west down the Loyalhanning Creek. His plan is to find a place that he can cut over the hill and get behind the French. And also find wherever the hell Mercer's gone.
Now we're currently facing across the 4 lanes of US 30 toward 2 Mile Run. It empties into the Loyalhanning Creek somewhere on the other side of the road. We're going to do some maneuvering and get on the other side of US 30 to continue in Washington's probable footsteps.
So we have just crossed over all 4 lanes of US 30, and we're now making our way up 2 Mile Run Road. This is probably the general direction that Washington crossed up the hill. He's crossing up behind the hill, remember, and either he's trying to do this to get behind the French, to help Mercer out, catch the French in the crossfire, or he's just doing it to find Mercer.
Something to keep in mind is that both Virginian parties would have been trekking through the Pennsylvania forest nearly naked, at least to 18th century eyes. Washington had instructed the 1st Virginia Regiment to put their old worn-out uniforms in stores, keeping just their linen shirts, which were accompanied by green wool for leggings and a breechcloth. As the campaign progressed, Washington also instructed his men to ditch their shoes for moccasins to obscure their footprints. This was partially out of practicality, as 4 years of fighting in the bushes had rubbed off on the 26-year-old colonel, but for the most part, it was out of necessity. Virginia as a colony was approaching bankruptcy, as was the British Empire at this rate. New uniforms for the veteran troops of Forbes' army was not in the budget. Knowing some of the ranks felt disrespected for having to dress so crudely, Washington claimed he would don what he called Indian dress himself. Forbes, however, later forbade any officer from not being in proper uniform. Washington would write later that he followed the sounds of gunfire until they were within a half-mile of the shooting. Then silence fell. Washington and his men were now themselves lost in the darkening, foggy woods just 2 miles south of Fort Ligonier. From here, information becomes even more sketchy. Some sources suggest one of the 2 Virginian parties had come across a French camp. Most likely this was Mercer earlier in the day. The gunfire the British heard back at Fort Ligonier had been from this encounter. However, if any attempt was made by Mercer or Washington to contact the other regiment to report of the French raiders being dispersed, it did not reach the other in time. It could have been anywhere along 2 Mile Run, like this narrow clearing where disaster struck. What follows is in Washington's own words, recollections written down in 1787. It being near dusk, and the intelligence not having been fully disseminated among Colonel Mercer's corps, and they, taking us for the enemy who had retreated, approaching in another direction, commenced a heavy fire upon the relieving party, which drew fire in return in spite of all exertions of the officers, one of whom and several privates were killed and many wounded before a stop could be put to it. To accomplish which, GW never was in more imminent danger by being between two fires, knocking up with his sword the presented pieces. A fellow Virginian officer, Captain Thomas Bullitt, was also present when the friendly fire incident broke out. However, it would not be until many years later when his nephew compiled his remarks into a memoir. Bullitt claimed, instead of falling with the French, they met themselves, the day being remarkably dark and foggy. Each party mistook the other for the enemy, and a very warm fire was immediately commenced on both sides. Captain Bullitt was one of the first who discovered the mistake, and running between the two parties, waving his hat and calling to them, put a stop to the firing. It was thought and said by several of the officers, and among others by Captain Bullitt, that Colonel Washington did not discover his usual activity and presence of mind upon this occasion. This censure thrown by Captain Bullitt upon his superior officer gave rise to a resentment in the mind of General Washington which never subsided. This claim of resentment I've thus far never found in any writings of Washington. On the contrary, Washington, like many officers, held Bullitt in high regard, and it was only after the campaign that Bullitt brushed into criticism, which you can learn more about in my video on Bullitt's defeat. In any case, if it was Washington who approached Mercer, or Mercer who happened upon Washington, if it was Bullitt or Washington himself that got the Virginians to cease fire, the damage had been done. The only official military record of the incident comes from a report filed by John Forbes on the 17th of November to his superior, James Abercrombie. I sent 500 men to give them chance with a man more to surround them. There was some killed on both sides, but unfortunately our parties fired upon each other in the dark, by which we lost 2 officers and 38 privates killed or missing. We made free prisoners from whom we have had the only intelligence of the enemy's strength, and which, if true, gives me great hopes.
Now, regardless of how this incident went down, what is known for certain is that once the smoke clears and the Virginians collect their brains and come back here to Fort Ligonier, they're not going to be alone. They're going to bring with them 3 prisoners. 2 of them were Native Americans, and the third one was dressed in a French uniform. However, he didn't speak French. He spoke perfect English. His name was Richard Johnson. It is believed that he had been captured by Native Americans earlier in the war. He was living around Lancaster County, and for some circumstances, he ended up being in the service of King Louis XV. He was now serving in the French army out here down at Fort Duquesne. So he's interrogated, and what he reveals is that Fort Duquesne is not how the British imagined it. The British were expected about at least 1,200 French soldiers down at the point, and they're expecting them to be armed to the teeth. After all, this is the most important position. Well, turns out that earlier in 1758, a group of Americans led by General Bradstreet were able to successfully destroy Fort Frontenac. Inside Fort Frontenac was caches of supplies for Fort Duquesne, their winter rations. They're not getting them this year. When word gets to the Native Americans that the French are poorly supplied, that they're not going to be able to really feed the Native Americans, let alone themselves, as well as being unable to do any more trades, many of the Native Americans got up and left beginning in October of 1758. Another reason being, John Forbes, he was smart. He knew that he had to come to terms with the Native Americans. He knew the Native Americans did not like the British. He knew the British did not like the Native Americans. But he convinced several key tribes, that if they swore neutrality for the remainder of the conflict, that they would be given this land back. That's what Forbes promised by signing what would become known as the Treaty of Easton. That sent even more of the Native Americans away from the French, sending them farther out west to wait out the rest of the war. So, Richard Johnson telling Forbes after the friendly fire incident all this information, that Fort Duquesne's weak, they don't have Native American allies. It makes Forbes pretty confident that they can march on Fort Duquesne even if the snow sets in, even if the weather becomes treacherous, and even if the Americans are not really trustworthy considering they just got themselves in a friendly fire incident. No matter the headaches, Forbes feel he is now confident he can capture Fort Duquesne by year's end. He reverses the decision to make this a winter quarters. He will march out on November 14th. He is going to begin advancing west. His army is going to be averaging about 12 to 14 miles of road a day. They're cutting through the woods. They're getting closer and closer to Fort Duquesne. On November 23rd, 1758, George Washington will be leading a brigade at the lead of Forbes' advance, and Washington will hear a massive explosion. He thinks initially it's the French artillery beginning their bombardments. But the following day, on November 24th, Washington will arrive at the point to find Fort Duquesne burnt. And it's kind of poetic that I am currently standing on the powder magazine of Fort Ligonier, because when the French got word that the British were just a few miles from Fort Duquesne, the French commandant down there ordered the evacuation. He ordered all 80 barrels of gunpowder from Fort Duquesne's powder magazine destroyed, destroying the fort in a massive explosion that can be seen for miles and heard even farther. On November 25th, 1758, John Forbes and the rest of the army will arrive at the point in full pomp and circumstance. He will order the following day to be a day of Thanksgiving, and he is going to write a series of letters to various officials in North America and back over in England, confirming the successful capture of the forks of the Ohio and the destruction of Fort Duquesne. Without a shot being fired, the British had achieved at last the goal that started the largest war in recorded history up to that point. Kind of anticlimactic, I know. No big battle for Fort Duquesne. But it was in fact 3 skirmishes, 3 small battles. We have talked today about the third and final one, the friendly fire incident. I actually wanted to do this in order. We're kind of doing this backwards, so I apologize. Hopefully next year when we get to the anniversaries, we'll talk about those 2 other small battles, those 2 other skirmishes of the Forbes campaign. But this was the third skirmish, the third, and I guess you can call decisive skirmish, decisive engagement of the Forbes campaign. The one that'll finally capture Fort Duquesne in the name of King George II in Great Britain. And it was triggered by your future first president of the United States in a friendly fire incident. Well, if you're hearing my voice at this time, that means you've reached the end of the video, and I hope you stayed all the way through because you enjoyed it. And if you did, hit that like button down below, as it helps us fight the YouTube algorithm and remind the algorithm that history videos matter. Also, if you want to see more videos from us here at Readout Productions, head on over to our main channel and subscribe to the page. We'll see you guys in the next video.